Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Robin Andersen, Professor Emerita of Media Studies at Fordham University and an award-winning author of a dozen single and co-authored books. Her work examines film, television, and media coverage of war, the environment, politics, and elections. Her latest book is The Complicit Lens, U.S. Media Coverage of Israel's Genocide in Gaza. I welcome Robin Andersen to Savage Minds. Your book, wherein you use the term the complicit lens to describe U.S. media, has become even more magnified in recent months. Could you describe for our listeners how this lens actively transforms military actions into defensive narratives?
Right. Gosh, well, there's a couple of mechanisms there. We seem to have been all the time watching this genocide, and it seemed to be two different realities. One was on the ground, and we had amazingly wonderful, courageous journalists, Palestinian journalists on the ground, telling us what was happening, showing us the images, the testimonials from civilians who were, the terrible victims of 2,000-pound bombs, in their neighborhoods and their taking out their buildings and things. That was one reality. The other reality was a completely different one that came from establishment media who were using Israeli talking points. They had allowed, particularly what we know from the New York Times and CNN, is they had allowed the Israeli military to influence their editorial decisions. So they continued to So we went from that on the ground reality to the media frames of establishment media. And what they were doing was allowing, and we know this from the New York Times and CNN leaks to The Intercept by the journalists, telling the people at The Intercept that they were being told what they could and could not say. And CNN was even putting all of their copy through the Jerusalem Bureau, so that the IDF had eyes on it. So you've got one frame that's doing an awful lot of things too, other things like, the passive voice, the constant accepting over and over again of fabricated evidence, all that stuff. But they were taking their cues from the Israeli military, and that's how we got this complicit coverage.
Could you talk a bit about this kind of master narrative that was established in the aftermath of October 7th that effectively constrained the boundaries of what many would consider acceptable debate for the months to follow? Right.
When you start an event, a standardized news frame is always to start with violence, right? So October 7th, began this whole thing. When, in fact, October 7th was simply one event out of a whole history of historical actions by which Israel had been oppressing Palestinians in the occupied territories for many years. We already had Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch identifying the occupation as illegal, and also that it was an apartheid system, that Israel had, created laws that made Palestinians second-class citizens. And in Gaza, they had a siege around it. Israel completely controlled the economics of Gaza. And by the time October 7th rolled around, the people in Gaza were hungry. They were dependent on UNRWA for their food, for a huge amount of food. And they were also already malnourished at that point from the siege of Gaza. So by taking all of that history out, during the time in which the Israel snipers fired on peaceful demonstrators during the Great March of Return who were at the wall in Gaza and saying, and they were having their views known in a nonviolent way. And Israel killed almost 300 of them and injured 33,000 people, and children had to have their legs amputated. So this is the kind of history we're talking about that led to this October 7th. Pulling it out and just starting it on October 7th and saying, this is a surprise. There's no reason for this. We've done nothing. Gee, it must be these awful, brutal, terroristic Arabs who are simply attacking us for no reason, and we just don't know. So when you've got this frame where the violence starts on October 7th by Hamas, what that leads to is everything after that the Israelis do is justified because it's defensive. It's merely retaliatory. It has nothing to do with their aggression. The other thing they did is the classic war frame where it's Israel against Hamas or Israel against the Palestinians, right? That wasn't a war. Hamas didn't have a standing army. They don't have a navy. They don't have a standing army. They don't have those kinds of weapons. And so what should have started in the first 25 days, they had killed 5,000 Palestinians. We should have started talking about genocide right then, because that's what they were doing. They were punishing the civilian population, and it was disproportionate violence. Both of those things are crimes of war.
Well, a lot of people approaching this from our country, the US specifically, I would argue other Western European countries, we've seen so many people in Britain on the alleged left who are supportive of Israel. Many people prefer to couch this as almost a chicken egg situation, like, well, it's a bit on both sides. And we've seen this over the course of the past 3 years, and even before, of course, where people mark their analyses as well, they're doing bad, and those guys over there are doing bad. What is the media doing to encourage this kind of middle roadism?
Yes, we've come to call that in media studies both sidesing. When the media identified this not as a genocide on Israel's part, but as a war between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and the Palestinians, well, they didn't tell both sides really, because we never heard from Hamas. We only heard from Hamas through the official statements of military people or U.S. military people. So right away, we never got the Hamas side of the story. So to create this frame, media had to completely abandon their commitment to tell all and both sides, both and by implications, all sides of the story. We were getting the Israeli side of the story. Also, when Israel bombed or shot at innocent civilians or anything like that, they would simply say that they were terrorists, they were in front of a line, or there was some Hamas people there. And then when they gave you the body counts of Palestinian civilians, they would qualify that with this statement, the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry. So right away, you've got, well, Israel says this, and the Gaza Health Ministry, whom they've demonized already, they qualified as if saying, well, these numbers, you can't trust them. And it was always qualified as this is Hamas. Of course, the American people had been desensitized to Palestinian killing, not only over all of the years approaching October 7th, but particularly after October 7th, when Israeli officials said, oh, look, Hamas attacked us. And instead of being appalled, Palestinians in Gaza are cheering the evil Hamas terrorists. So now we're going to cut off everything. We're going to cut off their aid. We're going to cut off their food. There'll be no water. It'll be a tent city. Basically, what they were admitting right there is they were going to perpetrate a genocide in Gaza. U.S. and the Western media particularly did not challenge that. Joe Biden said, Israel can defend itself, full stop,
Yeah.
meaning anything goes, right?
Yeah.
And they never stopped. And that frame was set up, and it was, it was this false balance between what Israel said and what Hamas said, who had been demonized. You never got the story that we got in our alternative and independent press, what the UN was saying, what the aid workers were saying, what Euromed on the ground, their staff members, Euromed Human Rights was telling people,
Right.
what the journalists on the ground were saying, right? It was all this Israeli side of the story.
Well, I call the way that reporting has happened from the West to the global South, I call it Bananarama. Of that song from the 80s, I Heard a Rumor. That's what it is. It's my media theory, Bananarama. Because we see it all the time. Iran, that was U.S. self-defense. The U.S. bombs another country. It's called self-defense. It's insane. So up is down, left is right. That's where we are. In your analysis, what role does the repetition of unverified Israeli military claims play in manufacturing the consent for this war?
Right. Well, every time Israel bombed a place or took out a hospital, they offered supposed evidence. So with the attacks on the Al-Shifa hospital, the first one, the beautiful Al-Shifa hospital that was called the Beating Heart of Gaza, in November 2023, the Israelis put out this slick 3-dimensional videotape, and they said, oh, there's a Hamas equivalent to a Pentagon underneath Al-Shifa hospital.
That's right.
Yeah, they were walking around. It looked like the most elaborate, somebody in the nation called it looked like a James Bond lair. But it was high tech, and went down 3 floors. It was just this astonishing thing. So they go into Al-Shifa hospital because the U.S. also says, oh, we've got intelligence, never quoting their intelligence, never identifying where it came from. Oh, no, we've got intelligence that says Hamas really is in the hospital, too. So they use this manufactured supposed evidence, and they take out an entire hospital. And the media reports it as fine because, yes, hospitals are, they say, protected under the international rules of war, but not if the enemy has gone in there and taken it over. Right? So they weren't really reporting on how they were breaking international law. Only if Israel made a claim that they weren't breaking international law. But Israel became very good at manipulating the language of international law and making claims. However, that was untrue. Even if Hamas actually had this crazy Pentagon underneath, which of course subsequently we found they did not, unsurprisingly. But even if they did, the Israelis were required to protect the doctors and patients in that hospital. It was unprecedented in conflict to actually destroy that hospital in November 2023. And then you debate about it, right? And you go in and you say, oh, yes, there's evidence here. They're lying again. The BBC showed that the videotape they presented was cut and it was, false. They point to a calendar on a wall and say, oh, look, that was where the terrorists were signed up to protect the hostages. Well, it was a calendar and days of the week, right? It was no such thing. But when you debate it and you stall and nothing ever happens, and then Israel takes out another hospital and they bomb another area and they kill more Palestinians, and you're going on and you're moving through time, these rapid news cycles, they're never held to account. They never really challenge them. They just move on to the next news cycle and the next bombing. That's how normalization of a situation occurs. So then the killing becomes normalized, and that's how they used these media frames and this constant repetition of unverified and actually known to be fabricated information as you move along. And it's outrageous that establishment media kept using those same sources and kept believing the IDF.
Yes, well, as we all know, you and I know, many of our listeners know, they extend the net of who is a terrorist to include doctors. Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, Ahmed al-Kahlul, Mohammed Abu Salih, Marwan al-Hams, and Adnan al-Burj are just a few of the doctors who have been accused of being Hamas members. And then they do one better. They accuse individual journalists of being Hamas members. So what happens is this operation is to make everyone suspect. So Bananarama works even better because you have to listen to the people we trust, the only democracy in the Middle East, air quotes. They can tell the truth.
Yes.
All these other people do not. It's insane. Another thing while you were talking, it reminded me, a lot of these narratives have been rinsed and repeated. Like it's a shampoo. We saw a lot of this stuff going on from Iraq 1, Iraq 2, the weapons of mass destruction narrative we have recently seen rewashed, not just in Iran last year and this year, but the basis of kidnapping Maduro and Flores. That was also, instead of WMD, it was fentanyl MD, right? Fentanyl of mass destruction. As if the U.S. has ever cared about the damage. I'm sorry, but I'm very angry about the war on drugs and the many decades of damage it has done, mostly African Americans in our own country and then across the border. So isn't it fascinating that legacy media is getting away with this, depending on us all to be amnesiac?
That's right. You know, there are things about this war that were different from wars in the past. And many things that were similar. Like they drew on World War I atrocity propaganda, the killing of innocents, the beheaded baby story. That comes right out of World War I when the Germans were supposedly bouncing babies off their bayonets and they were monsters, right? That wasn't true. Neither was during the first Gulf War. The Kuwaiti, royal family member recounting that supposedly over 300 babies were thrown out of their incubators. There were no incubators up there. Can you imagine in a small rural town in Kuwait that you've got, first of all, a rural hospital like that can possibly contain 300 babies in incubators right from the start, but you're in this fog, right? You're in this propaganda fog, and you can't see through the logic of these over and over.
Well, I was thinking about the layers you mentioned. They say under Al Shifa, they said that exactly about bin Laden. Remember? They had even in the New York Times these architectural drawings of his underground lair as if it were a 007 feature.
What happened after the war on terror is, if you recall, and you're so right to point out it, it's always weapons of mass destruction or it's drugs. So they tap into these things that are in our culture that we're supposed to be very fearful of, or that are justifications for attack of any kind, whether it's police attack or military attack, right? But after the war on terror, the New York Times and the Washington Post, if you recall, their public editors have these long apologies to their readers. We're sorry, we were not critical enough of the Bush administration's claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and we were not questioning enough about that he had a connection to the Al Qaeda terrorists, to the terrorists who that is to say, who took down the Twin Towers. And so, with all of that, Israel has never been held accountable, and that's one of the ways in which this can keep happening. They took out Shireen Abu Akleh in 2021, the wonderful American Palestinian journalist who was reporting from the West Bank, and they got away with it. So they keep getting away with, first of all, they would just deny that they targeted the journalists, or they wouldn't really mention that the doctors were terrorists. But then as they got used to all this killing, then all they had to say was, was Homs al-Dub, the son of Wael al-Dub, the Al Jazeera bureau chief in Gaza. They killed his son. They killed Wael's family, and they said he was a terrorist. The Committee to Protect Journalists investigated that. It was a false claim based on another false audio tape this time of supposedly these two Hamas terrorists talking to one another and saying, "Oh, Hamza gave us this." They weren't even Palestinian. They weren't speaking Palestinian Arab. They didn't have the right vocabulary. They didn't have the right accents. So you see, you can simply throw something out there if the media's not going to look at it before it reports on it, and then you're going to kill somebody else and you're going to move to the next story, and then you're going to, and that's how all of this over and over kept happening. And the media is responsible for this. They have never held them accountable. They have never, that's not true. They have never, rarely. For example, the Washington Post did do a very good investigation under Al-Shifa Hospital. And they said that many of the tunnels that the Israelis claimed were connected to the hospital were in fact not. And in fact, the place where they said they were holding hostages had not been occupied. The rest of mainstream media did not pick that story up, with the single exception that I found of the Rolling Stone. And Rolling Stone did an amazing summary of that investigation. But you see, once you get the propaganda out there and you've got this momentum of constant demonization, constant denial and justification, the odd story here and there doesn't change the frame. That's the problem.
Well, yes, and also we know from history, again, the second Iraq War and the global war on terror, the U.S. government used journalists or their over-reliance on intelligence, bad intelligence, and I'm thinking of Judith Miller. Yes, she was shown the door at the New York Times, but has the New York Times really apologized for what is often called a feedback loop strategy, where Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell knew that she was relying on faulty intelligence to create those stories, and then they used those stories as a means to sucker support for the war on terror? Wasn't that insane?
It is, and they're still doing it, and that's a very standard frame for establishment media. And what that tells us is that the media serves a function. We call it the manufacturer's consent. Well, as it turns out, this genocide, they did not manufacture consent for the entire global publics because we had on our cell phones, on our handheld devices, particularly young people who get most of their news from their handheld devices, right? And online media. Yeah. They weren't watching that, and they were watching on the ground. So that's why we have such global opposition. That's why Israel has become a rogue state. That's why Israel's favorable ratings are absolutely in the tank. But who they do manufacture consent for is the global elite and those who are running the military. As long as they can see that type of coverage and they can look to it and they can source it. Oh, look, they're saying this. They're believing their story. They think they're in their own little propaganda bubble, of power and military action, and and they can keep on doing what they feel they can keep on doing what they're doing. So that's who we're enabling, the actual perpetrators of this thing globally.
Aside from your work in the complicit lens, I think it's important to note many people like Jimmy Dore, they talk about the links between, for instance, Big Pharma and the media. Who is funding the news? But aside from who funds the major media outlets, we've got this feedback loop with government. Or we have the backdoor revolving door, as it's called, between people, let's say, heading the FDA one day after they left a major pharmaceutical company, or vice versa, right?
Right.
So
sure.
It's fascinating how what we'd call conflict of interest in a legal sense and basic lack of ethics is allowed at the highest levels in media. For instance, how do U.S. newsrooms justify the use of passive language? It's like I can see it. My children can see this. Aid-related deaths versus massacre. Were killed versus, when it's an Israeli, were murdered. And we see the choice of vocabulary when reporting on civilian deaths, and we even see the elision of civilian deaths being elaborated at all when it comes to our quote-unquote enemy.
Yes, and to accomplish getting away with this passive language, they really did have to abandon all of their professional guidelines and principles, because if you think about how a journalism story is supposed to be constructed, it's supposed to be who, what, where, and when, right? Who did it? What did they do? And why did they do it? And when did they do it? Right? They couldn't even tell us the basic stuff. They couldn't say Israel dropped this bomb. And so it was obscured. There was no real, actual descriptive reporting from on the ground. As for how they get away with this at the highest echelons of media, it's because of the way the media is structured and ownership. You have the same board of directors of these very highly conglomerated, centralized media companies. We used to have much more independent ownership. Well, these are highly centralized corporate entities that make their money on profits, right? Not on their mission to bring the truth to the American public, right? They're profit-making entities, and as such, in the board of directors, we call them interlocking directorates. So on a media organizations, you've got the same people that are serving on the board of directors of the major corporations, such as the pharmaceutical industry you mentioned, but also the extractive industries, and certainly very connected, even economically, to the military-industrial complex. So a lot of these of the shaping of what can and cannot be said on media is a consequence of ownership. And we've known that for a very long time. And basically what we have to do is go back in and decouple this conglomerate ownership in the media industry.
And you also discuss in your book how mainstream outlets frame the destruction of medical infrastructure. How does the contested narrative neutralize international law violations? You mentioned self-defense, but clearly anyone with a modicum of knowledge about international law would know that people who are oppressed have every right to defend themselves.
That's right. And there certainly is an argument to be made, but certainly no one seems to have been making it, that the occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal and has been called illegal. These things are supposed to happen for 6 months. But the way the Israelis have oppressed the Palestinians, if they don't like journalism, they call it incitement. And they well before October 7th, and they simply jailed the journalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many ways in which they have violated international law toward civilians with restriction of aid. And that is something that has been really downplayed in U.S. media. So, for example, a couple of studies were done that showed Israel was really so good at twisting that around. And we already talked about how if you simply identify a doctor, a journalist, as a terrorist, that somehow you're back within this frame of this encapsulated narrative where Hamas and as the terrorists did all the bad stuff, and Israel, as in a defensive mode, can now do anything they want to a terrorist. That was the way in which the establishment media was functioning. But indeed, that is not true. So you simply can't bomb an entire neighborhood and take out 2 or 3 apartment buildings and a whole lineage of families and say, I was trying to get a Hamas fighter underneath there, right? And that is how the mainstream media establishment, as long as you had them targeting, not deliberately targeting civilians, but targeting a Hamas fighter who was identified as a terrorist, then that was okay, right? You could take out as many civilians as you wanted. That was the assumption of establishment media. It was completely and has been and always will be wrong, right? But they said it anyway. And like the doctors, I mean, my goodness, you named all of those beautiful doctors who are the most giving and amazing humanitarians who stayed on the ground to help care for the wounded and the dying civilians, and they had to watch them come in on their gurneys and watch them die in front of them. I mean, and Dr. Sophia, he was the last one that wouldn't leave that hospital, and he stayed there, and they hated him because he had an international voice, and it was being amplified. And that's one of the reasons that they still have him in jail, and they're still torturing him. And whenever I think about it, I just can't bear it. But because they say these people are terrorists, they can torture them to death. No, they can't. And that's why we need to be telling the media that you can't keep saying this. Of course, now that we see it, this Gaza framework and the Gaza strategy being applied in Lebanon, where they're taking out the hospitals, they're taking out unarmed medics, they're taking out journalists, doing the same thing, saying all they've done is substitute Hamas for Hezbollah. Now they're doing the same thing in Lebanon. And what the U.S. media here has done is Gaza has completely dropped out of the media frame. There's no way to justify it anymore. So they can't do Gaza, but they can let the same thing be happening in Lebanon. And they're still not calling Israel out. They're talking about evacuation because displacement is a war crime. They're talking about a buffer zone because they won't let them call it genocide, because taking out entire villages is exactly that. It's genocide. But they're using the Gaza playbook now across greater Israel as they expand their territory.
I've been noticing and speaking to some of our guests about that term. These are terms that were used for urban planning to extend a city, quote unquote, naturally, because we have so many people coming to New York or to London. So Greater London began to be used at a certain point in the 20th century as parts of London extended. Having lived in London, I did one of the walking tours, and I was very surprised to learn that London was just a series of hamlets once upon a time. And I'm thinking back to Shakespeare,
right,
divided by many canals. So greater became this way of, okay, we're joining geographically. Israel has taken that page and recycled it for its own use. The US media especially, but even European media, is not questioning this. It's almost as if it's giving an autochthonous tone to, well, it's theirs. It's like
right.
the white paper much. So we don't see, outside of Al Jazeera, you will not see any deep discussions about the framing and formation of Israel. Aside from now films that are being made, especially this year, there's a slew of excellent films coming out by Palestinian filmmakers talking about the history. How is it that Americans in 1992, when we celebrated the 500 years of the conquest of the Americas, and even at NYU, I remember there were many courses on this. Tzvetan Todorov was being taught out of every humanities syllabus because it was very important to understand there was no discovery at all. We can understand that. But on the same token, we can't see what happened in Israel as just as violent. I'm wondering about how media feeds that, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we're living in really crazy times. And the more I speak to people who consider themselves on the left, the more I realize how many of these people don't really understand what the left is, because you cannot support a genocide and be on the left in my books. That said, there are a lot of people who will say, well, I am a leftist, but Israel has a right to exist. They sound like Piers Morgan back in the first months after 7 October.
Right.
How much of this is a genuflection or a mea culpa to the Holocaust and this kind of collective historical guilt around that? And I finger point to the British subjects themselves because it was their government largely responsible for what went on. And two, in the same vein, the fact that there's this kind of will to not be seen as on the wrong side of history, which paradoxically pits these people
right on the wrong side of history.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. It goes back to, of course, in Britain, the Balfour Declaration of 2017 and Rashid Halidi's wonderful book, The 100-Year War on Palestine, tells that history. I think that people who are on the left, who still want to say Israel has a right to exist, they don't know the history. They simply don't know the history. And right now, Rashid Halidi, who wrote The 100-Year War on Palestine, he wrote the introduction to my book. He also had to resign from Columbia University because they wouldn't allowing the outside monitors to come into the university and look at people's syllabi and what they were teaching in their class made it impossible for him to teach Middle Eastern history, particularly the history of Palestine, because he couldn't even talk about the laws that Israel created that made the Palestinians second-class citizens in their own country. Of course, the very founding of Israel is based on a settler colonial state that was, launched as an outpost by the West in the Middle East for their own, imperial design. So that's what nobody can really come to terms with in terms of the state of Israel. When we say Israel has a right to exist, Francesca Albanese's wonderful remark where I don't know if you've seen the tape, but she's a journalist has clearly asked her the question, and she calms herself and she says, Israel, France, Italy, they have a right to exist. They can merge. They can do whatever they want. They exist. She says they exist. But states don't have a right to exist. Only human beings have a right to exist in international law. The foundation of Israel also was created on a myth, which we're not taught in school, because really, if you want to talk about Israel, how Israel has manufactured consent, Israel manufactured consent before October 7th, in that their lobby has been around for a very long time. And they've been banning, Palestinian student organizations, like at my university, Fordham, well before October 7th. Mm-hmm. So the Israelis have been very effective at closing down any criticism of the state of Israel, in the 21st century, and doing it for years. So you've got Golda Meir, and Golda Meir says, then they keep repeating this over and over. We founded a land. It was a land without a people for a people without a land. We went there. There were deserts. There were, there's a wonderful, panel where you've got of going around online where you've got Golda Meir saying that, and then you've got another Palestinian, and I think it's actually the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, who says, no, there was a thriving culture there had been there for millennium, and there was no empty land that Israel came. So we've got this foundational origin myth that keeps that is kind of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, the only the safe place for Jews on the hill. And yes, a lot of it is based on Western guilt after World War II, and just the absolute appropriation. And of course, do you know that many of the gangs that pushed the Palestinians off their land were later, by the state of Israel, identified as terrorist organizations? So it was terrorism and brutality that moved the Palestinians off their land. And the Jabalia refugee camp, that I talked about in terms of one of the first bombings that Israel did in Gaza, Jabalia was peopled by the direct descendants of the people who were pushed out of other Palestinian territories during the Nakba. So one of the things that the New York Times also banned from their journalists, they wouldn't allow their journalists to say, was refugee camp. You look at refugee camp and you go, why? Precisely because if you say refugee camp, people might say, well, why is it a refugee camp? Because these are refugees from the Nakba. And that's who we're talking about. They're bombing and they're destroying their culture and their housing again, right? So this has been a huge historical process to get to this point where now we just accept in mainstream media the greater Israel.
Yes. And it's fascinating how even the word refugee is refused because that would presume that they would have a right to return, which Israel works very hard to prohibit. Hence, many of our listeners will not know perhaps about the keys that many Palestinians will wear around their neck back to their homes, which are currently occupied by Israeli settlers. How does the reliance on anonymous U.S. or Israeli intelligence officials protect the media from accountability when claims are later debunked? I gave earlier the example of Judith Miller. I think we could include Jeffrey Goldberg in that over Iraq too. But we're seeing a constant flux of oopsies, and there's no official accountability. And I don't mean firing a journalist. I mean serious accountability. We don't have any kind of oversight over the level of destruction that is happening. How does the reliance on anonymous U.S. or Israeli intelligence officials protect the media from accountability where claims are later debunked? I mentioned Judith Miller. We can add Jeffrey Goldberg. We can add loads of other journalists and/or, again, Condoleezza Rice. Oh, pretty much every U.S. president, when they make claims coming from intelligence that is later found to be fake news, to quote Trump.
Right.
This also acts to cushion legacy media from any responsibility. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, it used to be a journalistic practice where you don't use anonymous sources. Of course, this is going way back. And over the years, anonymous sources became the standard. And of course, what we know about war is that you move forward with domestic repression from one war to the next, because as you create war, if you're getting close to being an empire, like, well, some of us say that the U.S. really has been an empire, or let's say call it global hegemony, the superpower with all the weapons, however you want to say the United States is. Denizens of an imperial state do not have civil liberties or human rights. That belongs to democracy. And when you constantly have war and you're pulling your media back because under national security grounds, that's the kind of buzzword that has been used over the years. And, we can't tell you that, national security. And as the papers of record, for example, the New York Times, is very dependent now on intelligence sources, right? They used to think about their ability to cover a war by being in the field, in the theater of operation, and that's why that was so that embedding in the war on terror was so important to the media. They were going to be with the journalists, right? Of course, over the shoulder, telling the U.S. military side of the story only. But now, when it's too dangerous, I guess, certainly Israel has shown that to be the case. They block them out of the theater of operation, and for Palestinian journalists, it just has become so dangerous. And that's a whole nother topic. But how we're going to find out about war these days is going to be anybody's guess. But over the years, U.S. establishment media, particularly the papers of record, have measured their ability to cover war not by the theater of battle anymore, but by their sources in the intelligence community. What we found is, if you recall, when they finally pulled out of Afghanistan under Joe Biden 20 years later, of an occupation where we gained nothing, and just killed a lot of people. Um, that was a complete failure of what the New York Times had been reporting. That, this is an occupation and it's going along fine. And all of a sudden, within a week, the Taliban came in and took back over their country, right? And that was amazing. And that was a piece I wrote about for Counterpunch about how that Afghanistan narrative collapsed because they were relying on intelligence sources who were simply not telling them the truth. So that's where we're at now. And in Gaza, there were a couple of important stories that were anonymously confirmed by quote unquote U.S. intelligence. One was the Al Shifa hospital, but there were a number of others. And Israeli intelligence was lots of things were happening behind the scenes where we were never informed of. Like, for example, that all the copy from CNN was going through the Jerusalem Bureau and the IDF had eyes on it. They never told us that. In fact, they really downplayed the idea that they were blocked out of Gaza. So all of their information was coming from missives and the talking points and the directives that were very well crafted by Israeli Hasbara. They managed to get away with an awful lot.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. And the invention of terms like blood libel. Yes, it has a meaning, but it is not what it is being represented to be. Everything's blood libel now. Everything's anti-Semitism. Right. And then I just saw Glenn Greenwald yesterday talk about this because everyone's fed up with this, including American Jews. You can't just run around calling a population of people who are against genocide anti-Semites. A, it's a bad look. And B, and maybe more importantly, in fact, it just is ignorance. One has nothing to do with the other.
Right.
Now, if only Americans were given the choice, how many trillions were spent on Iraq too? 20 years, how many Americans, Afghanis, how many people died? The body count, we know Tommy Franks infamously said we don't do body counts, but everywhere from various think tanks in the Northeast to Harvard and various other groups have estimated that the body counts can be quite high. And I mean in the 7 figures. We don't know. Right. With the money that was put in the global war on terror, not only was it what was called post 9/11 blowback, we have made the U.S., American citizens, more at risk than ever, more hated than ever. Can you blame them? Can you blame people for hating our country? I can't. And on top of that, how many Americans could have gone to university for free, gone to trade schools for free? How much housing could have been built, allowing people to live for next to free, right? Council housing in the UK, social housing in the US. And this is what's interesting is now people on the right are opening their eyes to this vast hemorrhage of money for nothing. And I'm seeing more and more people on both sides of the aisle addressing this in realpolitik terms and saying, we have just wasted, aside from valuable lives, people will never know because we were told not to care about them because dark-skinned people don't matter. And that was also a leitmotif of the media, albeit not mentioned. We are seeing the amount of money as Americans are now having to pay figures of petrol that they've never had to pay before. It makes the 1970s petrol lines. Remember those? I was a kid, and I remember my father getting out of the car and speaking to other men and women outside of their car because in the late 70s and even early 70s, there were various moments when we had to queue up. Legacy media is failing, and it's so failing that you've got more people watching Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, any kind of independent media on the left than CNN or Fox is getting in a single week. It's amazing. I mean, Joe Rogan, we already knew about, but you are getting people following on all sides of the aisle. The left-right divide is being collapsed and it has been being collapsed for some time, but most definitely it's in free fall since 3 January. I think a lot of Americans on the right were like, well, we just kidnapped a sitting leader. Like, how would we feel if they came and took Trump? Well, a lot of us would be happy if they took Trump, but you know what I mean. So can you talk a bit about the way that journalistic integrity has gone in a free fall since, I would argue, the 1970s? I just heard a show the other day, I cannot remember which, talking about Mike Wallace. Well, there were many other journalists talking about social issues on the ground, looking at the resistance to Vietnam, our involvement in Vietnam, and the conscription that was happening to American men at the time. And in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of lives lost. Yet, we've noticed since the global war on terror, no one cares about lives lost. Not really.
No, because lives lost are just numbers. They're presented as abstractions. And so we don't think of them as humans anymore, really. Body counts have become meaningless since Vietnam. So if you say, I mean, and really, they're so inaccurate. What do we have now in Gaza? 72,000? You know, Francesca Albanese again has put out and the Lancet has been putting out reports. I mean, early on, and by early 2025, the Lancet was saying at least 187,000 people have to be dead in Gaza. The latest is 250,000 if you consider everybody who in this area, this catastrophic area that is now Gaza, and how they've got no food, they've got no aid, they've got no medical. How on earth can they not be dying in great numbers a day, apart from the 1,000 that Israel has killed again since this supposed ceasefire? So, you know, we're talking about unfathomable kind of suffering, and the body count does not make it because it's not talking with human compassion. In terms of the media since the 1970s, that's a big crowd. But let me just say that with the increased conglomeration and corporatization and monetization of the media for profit, what news organizations understood is if you go to lifestyle, if you go to culture wars, that kind of thing is much more attention grabbing, and it's a better use of your frame and your outlet and your staff to make a profit. Whereas connecting the dots, and this is what we're getting at now. Media under these conditions never connect the dots. So you've got fragmented, you've got one conflict here, you've got one conflict there, and you were pointing out that, yeah, we're starting to put it together. We're starting to put together the deprivation in American economics and in our society and in our health and well-being and everywhere, because we're pouring money into this massive weaponry machine, and we're going out into the globe to protect the extractive industries and oil. I mean, that's what this Middle East is about. I just wrote a piece for Jacobin that came out, and it's about the clash of civilizations and Edward Said's takedown of that. And we're still operating in the clash of civilizations, right? And in it, Edward Said says, we don't connect all of this armed camps, battling each other, the U.S. and Islam. We don't connect it to the destruction of our lives and their lives. And in the piece, I quote, the former ice cream maker, Ben Cohen, who is demonstrating, before Congress to try to block Israel, sending Israel more weapons. And he's got his hands behind his back, and Ben Cohen says, and then somebody calls out, what are you demonstrating? What is your point? And he said, I'm trying to tell this Congress that we're sending all of this weaponry to Israel to kill Palestinian children, and we're dropping our children in the U.S. off Medicare and Medicaid, and they're going to bed hungry. That's the kind of connections that we are now obviously making, but you're not going to see those kind of connecting the dots in U.S. media.
Well, there's a lot of money to be made in keeping that left-right divide alive. And one thing that's made me really thrilled is to see so many people on the right. Candace Owens has been a battle axe on this. She is she has dismantled Ben Shapiro and his pygmy donkey. I forgot what she called it, midget donkey. Brilliant. She has taken it down. Not just her, though. It's really wonderful to see Tucker Carlson go after this, because the humanity is what binds us all, left and right. And I think it's a shout out to those on the left that like to pretend that people on the right are all bigots and all. No, I think the last 3 years have shown us that we're united against genocide. And I think that's what counts. Now, am I saying that everyone who's a Zionist is really literally wanting a genocide? No, I think a lot of these people are brainwashed by the very issues we're discussing now. For instance, the exclusion of Palestinian perspectives in U.S. media is something you also touch upon in your book.
Right.
Can you talk about the link between their elision from representation and the extent that this kind of media behavior is a departure from journalistic integrity of the pre-Reagan years?
In a way, the U.S. media, we as a country have never been good at reaching out across the globe and explaining to people, or having just going into other countries and reporting on them. Like, what's happening in Spain yesterday, and what kind of a culture does Spain have? You know, when the U.S. started bombing Iran, some people started posting this wonderful hour-long program that Rick Steves, the kind of mainstream fun guy who goes around to other countries and does his little, you know, they used to have him on PBS 5 minutes, but Rick Steves does a whole hour long, and he was amazing. And he says, whoa, we've got this whole country of Iran. Let's go see how they live. Let's go look at them. Let's go understand them, right? Mm-hmm. Then you've got, you know, we're dependent on looking at other kinds of media output. And then you have the amazing Anthony Bourdain, and he goes to Palestine. And he says, you know, whatever you think about it, we're here. And these are, and the same thing that Rick Steves said about Iranians. These people are friendly. They're nice. They're people just like you and I. But we are very parochial in our media in the U.S. We don't understand geography. How many Americans really understand geography? I don't know. I don't remember taking very many world history classes, even in my, all through my education. I've got a PhD. So, as Americans, we're used to that kind of thing, and it makes it so much easier for them to demonize the enemy. And that's the first requirement. You can't carry out a genocide without incitement to genocide, which always entails false rhetorical campaigns, and the demonization of the enemy. And if we beginning by not knowing much about the enemy, quote unquote, and we certainly, the Israeli lobby, as I mentioned before, has been very effective in blocking that understanding about Palestinians. And, you can't talk about Palestinians. We've had the Canary Mission for years and years, stifling faculty and students on university campuses who, if you start talking about Palestine or criticizing the state of Israel, you won't be getting a job, or you may well be fired from your job. And the Canary Mission has a long history of doing that. So you've got these very powerful lobbies who have been operating in our public sphere and in our civic society, so that we start out not knowing much about anything, and then, the likes of Hillary Clinton likes to say the people on the students on campuses don't know anything about history, and they don't know anything about Middle Eastern history. Let me tell you, those students at Columbia knew a lot more about Middle Eastern history than the likes of Hillary Clinton. They knew that Hind Rajab was a 5-year-old girl who had been blown away by 335 bullets at the end of January 2024, and they unfurled the banner Hind Hall at the end of March 2024. And they knew well who she was, that little girl, because they knew what was going on. And And what did the U.S. media say about the campus encampments? They called them youngsters. So they infantilized the students and adultified Hind, as CNN remarked, oh, this was a woman in Gaza. She didn't even know that Hind Rajab was a child. And she had 2 months at CNN to understand who this child was who had been killed. Right? So media don't, when she went on, she didn't have to know anything about Palestine. She didn't have to know anything because she was taking directly the talking points in this case from the NYPD, who was being advised by a counterterrorism expert on the Columbia campus who had an office in Tel Aviv. So we're talking some very dramatic closing down of media frames, of background knowledge and current knowledge of a genocide.
Yes. In fact, I have to wonder how much these dichotomies, we spoke about left, right earlier, but the polarization that has gone on through left and right narratives, and I mean caricatures of the other, because I'll see this often from people on the left, especially women who love Hillary Clinton. And my blood boils when I think of her, about
Me too.
Her involvement in the mass rapes that took place in Honduras and Libya.
Yep.
And I tell these feminists, almost every social media you post is about believe all women and rape is bad. Truisms, by the way, about rape is bad. But she was responsible for the murder of Gaddafi, and he was raped to death by bayonet. I just don't see how you can stand on the same logic here. I do think that a lot of these politics has come down to this kind of, talk media theory here a moment, Neil Postman's amusing ourselves to death. And I'm wondering what he would have to say about all this, were he alive, to analyze the current media climate around Gaza. Part of me thinks he would have argued that modern communication platforms inherently trivialize the horrors of war by transforming this genocide, other geopolitical events, and human suffering into this kind of fragmented emotional spectacle, one after another. That was a major part of the thesis of that book. I think that there is a tendency, and Postman famously warned that modern media detaches information from meaningful action. Right. And I think there's a tendency with social media, and it's great that everyone is able to see facts. It's horrible. We're getting live streamed to genocide. I think it's disgusting, really, when we think about this deep down. And there are moments when I'm like doing dishes and I get into deep meditative states when I do things and I just think, oh my God, what is this doing to our soul? On the other hand, it trivializes death. We're being informed, yes, but it trivializes these deaths. And I have to think about that when I run photos. I try to be very careful about not running children, that you can be seen, recognize them because of consent issues. But at the same time, there's suffering that is happening. Meanwhile, what we're seeing on that side of the pond, at least, a lot of people are complaining about the rising fuel prices, the rising this, and it's good if that results in action. But the media is actively working against action because it is trying to activate, look what they did with that insane appointment to the media. What is her name? I'm blanking on her name. I can't stand her. Oh my
Weiss.
God, Barry Weiss. Oh no, but I've got, it's her and Hillary Clinton now. She is single-handedly destroying the media for them. So on the one hand, keep at it, Barry, keep going. On the other hand, they've just given her another position, right? And it's like, do you think that her failure will get you some success in the end? It's really weird. It's almost as if they don't understand what's happening outside of legacy media. So I'm wondering if you might speak a bit about this kind of collapse of mainstream media. It's in free fall now, totally. And the fact that these people who are running legacy media outlets do not understand that
they are
they're
losing. CBS being CBS News, our one real legacy channel. I mean, whatever you thought of CBS, it had its problems, but it is the channel of Edward R. Murrow. It's a network of Edward R. Murrow, and they invented broadcast journalism during World War II. Him and his buddies, and they are David Ellison's and the Ellison family, now billionaire media moguls, self-professed Zionists, and Barry Weiss is a self-professed fanatical Zionist. What we're up against now is billionaire capture that completely controls the news frame, and that's what we're seeing in America. And it's so very dangerous. And Scott Pelley, long time, 37 years at 60 Minutes. And he wrote, or he went on a number of interviews and said that she had instructed him, Barry Weiss had instructed him and compelled him to, let's say let's show that Renee Good, who was killed by ICE in Minneapolis, let's show that she was actually aiming at the ICE agent, which is, of course, untrue. And he said that was outrageous. And also she said, let's show these anti-Trump demonstrators to be more violent, right? Now you don't have the Israelis shaping the news frame. You have basically a self-professed fanatical Zionist shaping the news frame and dismantling CBS News, because nobody is going to want nobody is going to want Fox News Light. They're just not going to want that. And they're looking for CBS, at least some semblance of the hard-hitting investigative journalists that CBS, that 60 Minutes sometimes does. But, in terms of the news frame and how we've been reporting war for so long through the war on terror and stuff, and the imagery that you were talking about, how you have to be cautious about putting on images of death, but actually, how do we do this? How do we show a genocide? And one of the key aspects of presenting people suffering is that you really have to give viewers and readers a way out. And that way out is to give them a politics. Otherwise, it's a severe emotional blow if you see a child without their limbs or a dead child. And as sometimes establishment media does print those stories. But they don't tell you this is Israel. They don't tell you we need to stop this. They don't tell viewers what they could possibly do, how our policies led to this, what we can do as citizens of this country and a supposed democracy to compel our politicians to not allow this and be complicit in the support of Israel's genocide anymore. You just put a dead body up, and then you say, "Oh, look, here's a dead person, but there was Hamas in that hospital, so they had to go in and kill all those people." What do you do with that as a viewer? It's a severe emotional blow. You're stunned. You don't know what to do, and you move away from it. This is something that Susan Sontag wrote about early on in her early life, where she looked at pictures of the Holocaust and the bodies in the Holocaust. And she said, nobody explained these things. Nobody provided any understanding. And she just looked at these picture books, right? So pictures are very, very important. And we have to give people a way out. You can't, however, the one positive thing about the next war after Gaza, which was, of course, there were a lot of them. You talked about Venezuela and Lebanon, Iran. But in Iran, I think the images of Gaza, what we could see on our phone, again, from those wonderful Palestinian journalists, made us understand finally that war is about death. War is about human suffering. These images that we saw were awful. Before, in the war on terror, it was all turned into a fun game with the merger between Hollywood and the Pentagon, with all of the blockbuster films using all of the U.S. weaponry. We didn't really show the battlefield. What we did is we transposed it onto a screen and we made it look fun and exciting. And we had first-person shooter games. And the people coming back from the war on terror would advise people with shooter games. And the same technology in the shooter game was the same computer-based technology that drops the bombs and that trains the bombers, right? So all of that merged in this audiovisual ownership milieu of a militarized culture. I think the Gaza genocide stopped that. And for the first time in American history, basically modern history for sure, the U.S. public was against the war in Iran. They tried to resurrect this fun frame with their stupid videotapes, and it failed. They did not resurrect it. They could not make this war on Iran a fun, exciting war. And also, Trump didn't get away with killing the young kids at that school, those children at the school, 156 of them on the first day of the bombing of Iran. He didn't get away with it. It was investigated. And we are now putting the connections together, making the connections not only between ourselves and people in other countries, but we are understanding that these weapons are about death, and they are also inflicting our lack of well-being and the hardship in our own country. And I think that's what's come out on the other end of this.
Well, one thing that you just mentioned, I got into trouble about when this happened, totally not into mowing down protesters and whatnot. But I was one of the people, when I saw the video of Renee Good, I thought, she should have got out of the car. Now, I'm not saying she deserved to die or nothing like that, but I'll tell you something. This is something that very few people, I don't know if anyone is talking about it. I keep banging on about it. We have sent men, mostly, some women, to Iraq 1 and 2. They have come back. They are the ones occupying these jobs in ICE and mall cops and other cops. These are men and women who have had great trauma. When I say great trauma, that should probably be underlined 100 times. We know a sliver of what happened during the second Iraq war and the global war on terror. It was horrible. We were lucky to get those black box sites of the torture of the infamous man that looked like he was wrapped up in garbage bags and being electrocuted.
From Abu Ghraib, yeah, from Abu Ghraib.
We're not talking about this problem that we have in our society, and we have a huge problem in the U.S. It comes down to the love of guns. And I don't want to get off on the Second Amendment too much here, but the way that we ship our wars overseas, our inability to understand the global war on drugs, because it has become that. It wasn't just Mexico. We had a war on drugs going on far beyond our borders. We had covert wars. I'll never forget when I moved to New York and I would read front to back the New York Times and finding little articles during the Reagan administration even. We were sending troops to Angola. What? That didn't get covered on the news. It was a little slice on the page 14, New York Times, section 2.
Right.
So we have all of these problems, and yet we're not talking about the fact that ICE, as terrible as it is, again, not saying I like ICE, but we are recycling these men and women who come back from these horrible wars because they have nowhere else to go, because they've been trained to be killers. We shouldn't be surprised by this, because we've put killers into the very seats of power, even if they're ICE agents or immigration agents or what they want to call themselves. We're not talking about this kind of cyclical export of violence and then re-importing it, because these men and women that go overseas to kill come back with mental health issues. We don't discuss this. And the media has been really, really slow on this as well. Back to 60 Minutes in the 1970s and 80s, got some really great stories about this. 60 Minutes and a few other outlets were running stories about the great harms that war brings back to our shores.
Right.
Why is it that in all of the legacy media messaging that's going on, we're shying away from that? Because is it that they just want to pit the left against right? That's my thesis, because it's really easy to have people shouting about ICE or the No Kings March, which was like, what are you saying? What do you want to do? What do you want to be? Rather than uniting people around no genocide, no exporting our wars and our weapons, and no supporting a regime that is heading towards almost the war against Palestinians has been going on for about a century. It was well before the formation of Israel.
Right. Well, we have a gun fetish in this country, promoted largely in the modern era, I think, by the National Rifle Association. And we know how corrupt that organization was. And they're the ones who misinterpreted the Second Amendment and said we all should have guns. But really, this is about the gun industry. But it's really two things, in my opinion. It's the wonderful writer Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz goes back historically and points out how the white militias were the first. They went out and gathered up the slaves, basically, that had run away from their owners, and that was the first militias that we had in this country, and that's the basis of law enforcement. And law enforcement in this country is very. We know that investigation after investigation in these major cities, from New Orleans to New York, has shown them to be racist. So there's that inherent thing. There's also, of course, this unity, this growing unity that has been happening for many years about police being trained in strategies that are military, and literally going over and having this kind of group training program between the Israelis and the Americans. We don't like to talk about the human cost to soldiers of fighting those wars, because more of them commit suicide when they get back based on how they've acted and what they've seen than are killed in combat. That started from the Vietnam War right through the War on Terror, and they come back traumatized. And it's not just that they saw their buddy blown up; it's that what they did, and that's the other thing. Even when they report on the conditions of soldiers who come back, it's never about what they had to engage in, and many of them talk about that. And I can't believe what I did. Right? That's a big secret in American media. But in terms of ICE, it's not only, I'm really mad that I didn't finish publishing this piece I was working on for quite a while, which examined the advertisements over the right-wing media. And they're using the same visuals and the same strategy from the conspiracy narratives and some of their favorite right-wing writers to recruit Proud Boys. I think there's probably a lot of vets there, but there's a whole lot of very organized vets against peace, which I'm going to be speaking with the veteran for peace in August in Kansas City. They're very well organized and they're very against the war. But I believe that from their recruiting strategy for these ICE members was into the very violent of the right-wing white supremacists. So it's probably a combination thereof. But we don't connect these dots again. We don't connect the weapons industry and how the weapons industry also profits from the gun industry, and how the gun industry advertises with military, showing military soldiers mowing people down, right? So these are all interconnected things to make America a very violent place, and one of the outlets is to then, if you make all these weapons, what if you make it? They're going to use it. If you build the cornfield, they're gonna come and play baseball. I don't know. Remember that movie? But if you make it, they're going to use it. The same thing with nuclear, and we're always under this horrible threat of nuclear weapons. And we don't do anything to, we've destroyed all the anti-proliferation treaties. And it's always used as, these days, we've seen it for Saddam Hussein and now with the Iranians. It's the weapons of mass destruction. Oh, look, so we probably won't stop making nuclear weapons just so we can use it as an excuse to go, hit another, innocent people in a country that we want to massacre. I don't know.
That kind of linking narratives is not happening at all in the media.
Right.
And that should be the prime role of what media people are doing, whether or not they're talking heads on TV, interviewers, or even on-the-ground journalists. Because, on-the-ground journalists tend to do the fact coverage. But at times, when they're signing out for CNN or whatnot, there are questions that they can ask and saying, have we seen this before?
Right.
You contrast mainstream coverage with independent media. I'm wondering if you could list some of the most critical stories that only independent outlets were able to capture.
Independent outlets picked up almost every story. They started out with right away the testimonials from people, from Israelis on the ground who experienced October 7th. A lot of these people were on Israeli media. U.S. mainstream media never picked up those testimonies. And what they said was, when the Israelis finally got there, the forces killed their own civilians. So right away, the October 7th mantra narrative, all of this is in response to Hamas killing 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians. Not true. We don't know how many people Hamas killed, but we do know that Apache helicopters were over the raid, dumping, just unloading their bellies with ordinances all along the way back to the Gaza border, over through the rave site, and that Israelis as well as Americans were killed. We have the testimony from Yasmin Borat, who talked about how when they finally got there, they killed she was with 12 hostages. They opened fire, and in that crossfire, everybody, the Hamas were killed and the hostages were killed. She was the only survivor. Right away, that was the lie that perpetuated the genocide. Right away, the independent and alternative media was there often to also provide context for what the journalists on the ground were reporting. So you had wonderful reporting by, the Gray Zone, the Electronic Intifada, Common Dreams, who went to the human rights organizations or other aid workers on the ground. And they augmented that coverage, and they gave us an understanding of what was really happening. They used the language of international law, which the mainstream media had been banned from even employing. So they explained things to us. For the rape story, almost immediately, our independent and alternative media and online sources, this wonderful online poster who goes by the moniker Squirrel, did some incredible investigation into that story, and it's debunked over and over again. And they used the same sources. This Yossi Landau, who was a known fabricator, had been exposed in Haaretz, and they over and over again. And so there were time and again when our independent media here in the States, and we depended on them to put this in perspectives, to let us understand that Israel actually had to be stopped, and that was the only way to end this genocide.
I wrote a book about the Second Intifada and suicide bombers there, the first 5 female suicide bombers. I came in to contact with Ezekov, and one of the workers was someone who came to me one day and said, "Why are you doing this work?" My research explained my motives in terms of understanding better why people so young were willing to blow themselves up. And he said, "You have Stockholm syndrome. You are in love with your oppressors." This is what he said. And he became the center of a chapter of my book because I found it very interesting, the ideological capture. Now, obviously, we've just talked about how Americans have been ideologically captured by legacy media. Israelis are also, to a lesser extent, the victims of what's going on in their own country. They have been duped by years and years and years and years of propaganda, both within their educational systems and in their everyday lives. Again, the same usual suspects come out and I thought you were a feminist. When I ran your piece for Savage Minds, when are you going to make a statement from Savage Minds apologizing for supporting rape culture? And I said, well, I guess you want Israel to apologize for its rape culture, because that's not what's gone on here if you've read the news. But I'm really curious about the Hasbara that went up within seconds. And as I've told the feminists, I said, you guys are calling this real? Come on. You are the first people to say it takes you months and months and months to get media attention on even real rapes, much less fake ones. And now you're going to suddenly say, oh, they got it right in less than 24 hours? That smells.
Right. Well, what I point out in my chapter about rape in the book is that you can't Yes, in this country, we should believe women, right? When you're taking personal testimony from a settler colonial state, which we know from settler colonialism that they use the fear of the brown body. There's a whole history of it. I go back to Angela Davis and talk about how these stories of rape have been propagated to keep brown people oppressed over and over again. And if you've got the intersectionality between, the regular rape culture and women, and then you have this kind of a story coming from a settler colonial state in the middle of a genocide, you must be very, very careful. The problem with the rape story was that there was not one verifiable piece of evidence in that piece, though it presented itself with new evidence. And we've got so much evidence. They had zero forensic evidence. They had zero witness testimony that was reliable. They had no primary witness. They had no visual evidence. So this was a very, very irresponsible piece put out right at the time when the South Africans were submitting their suit to the International Court of Justice. So it was a huge distraction. There's so many things wrong with that rape story. It was unbelievable. So no. Now, in your back to here's the thing: pro-Zionists who condone this, let's just say condone. Let's just say they're not rah about genocide. But if you're defending Israel, if you're one of the, even if you're a person, if you're not a bot now online and you're constantly ha-ing against this or what or if you're defending Israel, you don't have any arguments. All of the facts. This is the most well-documented genocide in the history of genocides. Yet it's the most contested. And so because Israel has a very effective Hasbara, and they will not stop lying, because the minute they stop lying or their lies are exposed, they're going to have to stop this genocide. You not only can you not have a genocide without an incitement, you can't have a genocide without its justification in the media, and that's what they're giving it. But they've got no rational arguments. There's nothing left. And you're so right to point out that on the face of it, the idea that if you criticize the state of Israel, especially when they're having a genocide, means that you are anti-Semitic is wrong in so many ways. It's on the surface. At first glance, it's a fiction. Right? It simply doesn't work. And if we go back and we look at its emergence, it was deliberately designed as a way to attack. And I'm quoting from my book in an article that was published by Mondowise, which points out that this reformulation of anti-Semitism as criticism of the state of Israel was to stop political action against the state of Israel. So it always had a politicized purpose. This is not by accident. And what we know well is, certainly in New York, not only were Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, the two primary youthful, anti-genocide organizations that are led and by Jewish women, they were the ones leading these. They closed down the Manhattan Bridge. They closed down Grand Central Station. They did all of these effective actions, and they were Jews. They were at the forefront of the anti-genocide protests.
Yeah, and they've been around for years. When I lived in New York City, I would always, one time I was visiting friends in Morningside Heights. I got out of the station there. They were protesting. There was nothing as great as what's going on now happening, but they were regularly active, and they were all in their 70s and 80s. Good for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Young people and old people. Right. It was a great cross-generational mix.
Yeah.
The elders in Jewish Voice for Peace, they're called the elders.
That's right. And I think it's also convenient to legacy media to obliterate the presence of these Jews. And it disturbs me greatly because it's, first of all, dishonest. And again, there's a detachment historically from what went on. Even before the formation of the State of Israel, There were discussions. There was an infamous conference at the end in the 1890s in Philadelphia around this. And you had a large group of American Jews who were very much against Zionism, radically opposed.
Right.
And this is not being sussed out in clear terms for the average American who's working 2-3 jobs, who doesn't have time to even Wikipedia it. Not like Wikipedia would give you exact data either.
Right.
We're in a point in our history where we're at an extreme economic crisis. So as I just said, people don't have time. Most people don't have time to do anything. They come home, couch potato time, if they can even do that, because they've got to make dinner for the kids and so forth. Yet I'm wondering if there's a challenge that's been presented by social media that is basically going up against toe-to-toe the hegemony of legacy media during this conflict. We've seen the hearts and minds of people have been turned because of the live coverage on their telephones. But is it having a long-lasting effect, do you think?
Oh, I believe it is. I think that most of the political analysis now is going on our online sources, particularly in this country. And we're getting the real story. We see the longer tapes of Trump. The mainstream media, has given Trump a microphone, but now they're starting to criticize him. Interestingly, when he said that when he was going to bomb Iran, he was going to take out the whole civilization. One very ironic thing is they actually called out the American president in legacy media for doing that, saying this could be considered, a war crime. That he's going to engage. If he wiped out a civilization, it would be a war crime. They have never said that about Netanyahu. That is so. They really haven't learned, but I think we are looking to the alternative and independent media now. And it's becoming far more prevalent, even though we have a lot of people in big tech who are, look what they did to TikTok, look at what Elon Musk, we really have to preserve these places. And I think we need to focus our activist attention toward stopping that kind of billionaire capture and the uses of the internet for all manner of nefarious stuff.
What do you say to journalists working within the systems who feel conflicted by the editorial mandates they're given?
Oh, sure, absolutely. They don't like this. I mean, finally, it got so extreme at CBS. Look what they did. They began to, in waves and waves, they got fired and they said, this is really bad. This is terrible what's happening to us. But they leaked the documents to The Intercept, right? So they knew it. And in fact, one of the New York Times staffers who had leaked the documents to The Intercept, he said, they told us not to say occupation. If we don't say occupation, it takes the whole core of the conflict out of the coverage. So they realized what was happening. It's the same with CNN. With CNN, on one of the calls, because they leaked numerous documents from CNN on one of the all hands on deck calls, a staffer is heard on a phone call saying, many of us were concerned that when the Israelis started talking about Palestinians as animals, that this could be considered incitement to violence. And he said, what comprised, for example, the first 7 pages of the South African document. So they knew that, and they didn't want to do that. And they knew that that's what was happening. But they left a legacy so that people like us and the other fellow, Brian Johnson's great new book too, about what was, about mainstream media, how to sell a genocide. And we've got another one coming out by Asel Rod, Don't Say Palestine. So there's going to be more material to use. And I see my book, I really hope my book, I have a fantasy that one day a lawyer will be in front of the Hague using my book as a source, a resource to look back at how media covered this, well documented in the book. So that's what I'm hoping for in the end.
One of the disadvantages of independent media, it's often underfunded. It can't have the reach that, say, the New York Times does, with having heads in almost every country and definitely in every region.
Right.
And that becomes a challenge. At the same time, we've seen the rise, we saw this with lockdown, the rise of the citizen journalist and people sending, I get tips all the time. Talk to this person about this subject. It's very interesting how citizen journalism is having a hand in legacy media. Candace Owens is regularly, just 2 nights ago, thanked a slew of people for helping her on something she had investigated. What do you think will happen now in the future, given this free fall? Barry Weiss continue to do the bidding of the Lord for us all, because I think she's going to bring down, I don't think she's going to do any good for CBS. And the Ellisons will soon regret having made that choice. I don't see that they're going to get out of this. On the other hand, you've got Netanyahu saying, our battle isn't on the ground. Remember that? He said that like 5 months ago. Our battle is on social media.
That's right. And they have really put tons more money into this. They've got all kinds of bots, and they are really out there. And, there are people who do policy that are very clear-eyed about what needs to happen. One of those things is that we do need to restructure these conglomerates. We need to break them up like we did Standard Oil. And we certainly, these mergers, these highly centralized mergers of the kind the Ellisons now they're going to be changing CNN. And again, however we want to talk about the criticism of CNN, it's still an important news source. But once you get a pro-Trumper in there, you let David Ellison direct CNN, it's going to be far worse. So I think our only hope is to look to online media and figure out ways to find a funding base for it. I think we all need to begin to look at it and use it as our main sources, and stop buying into this establishment media who are becoming more and more useless. And I think young people are really into that.
Looking ahead, what is the most important lesson from your research for the future of democratic discourse within the U.S.?
I think that our future for democratic discourse is to rely on the people that we know, is to, never accept something that you read either online or in one article. You've got to check the sources. Who are their sources? Is it believable? I think there are many of my friends in Project Censored who are very good at laying out what media literacy looks like, why it's important, and how we need to really implement it to give people a sense of power, to give them a critical view of all kinds of media, and get them really to be doing meaningful discourse on their own, and take the means of production of the media in their own hands as well. So, I found in my book that so many social media users on different platforms could see right through these headlines and right through this, and I pose them against establishment media. And I frequently quote someone who made an excellent point. So we have to really be applying and paying attention and applying our brains, our smart brains and our sensibilities and our own native morality to the world around us. And I think that's who we need to rely on.